The film starts in a park with a lot of children playing on the swings as well as the slides and other activities. An ice cream truck is near the sidewalk with a clown giving out free balloons to the kids and friendly music playing in the background. Lynn Markey is 9 years of age, has long brown hair, with her little brother that is 5 years old with short hair. Both of them are on the seesaw going up and down singing nursery rhymes that they learnt from their grandmother Elizabeth Andrea Markey. Her brother's name is Eddie Richard Markey, and they are very happy and come off the rides to get some ice cream cones from the clown. The grandmother Elizabeth Andrea Markey is sitting reading a black book with some symbols on the front of the cover and mumbling some words that only she knows. The kids walk over to the grandmother and say, "Let's go home and feed our cats." The grandmother walks over to the ice cream truck and asks for a napkin to wipe down the kids' faces full of ice cream. All of a sudden 2 men did not want to move, blocking grandmother, and says, "Excuse me, we were here first." The grandmother smiles and waits her turn in a pleasant manner as the rude man Tom says, "I'd like vanilla, chocolate and strawberry mixed together." The ice cream merchant says, "We can only mix 2 flavors only at a time." The rude man Tom repeats it again and says, "I do not care, I want my ice cream my way or the highway, or I will call the cops and tell them you do not have a permit to be in this park." The ice cream merchant abides by his second command and tells him, "Okay, this is the only time I will do it for you." The rude man Tom takes the ice cream and says, "No tips for you, I'll see you around tomorrow." He pushes all the napkins on the table, but the grandmother grabs them before they all hit the ground. The rude man Tom walks away in disgust. Meanwhile, the little girl sees an officer at the end of the street and walks over to him, but the grandmother stops her and stares at her face and says slowly, "Shh! It's a secret, do not tell anybody anything that involves your family, okay my love?" She nods her head and says, "Yes grandmother, I will keep it a secret and not tell nobody," and holds her brother's hand and grandmother's hand and walks to their house a couple of blocks away. They all get home and the grandmother opens the door and the kids walk inside and the grandmother closes the behind them. The grandmother says, "Let's get ready for dinner, go and wash your hands." The kids go into the bathroom and start washing their hands and wiping them with a towel. The grandmother starts cooking a pot roast in the oven with potatoes and a salad for the whole family to enjoy. The grandmother grabs the big book with symbols and brings it into the garage near the parked vehicle is. They all start eating dinner together and the phone rings several times, but nobody moves, but the little boy tugs on her sister and says the phone is ringing. The little girl waves at the grandmother and says that the phone is ringing and points to the phone with her hand. The grandmother picks it up and hangs up immediately and says to the daughter, "Shh! It's a secret." They finish their meal and the grandmother puts a little boy in his room and says good night and shuts off the light. The grandmother walks the little girl to her room and looks at her eyes and says, "Hush! It's a secret and good night my love, sweet dreams." The grandmother turns off the light and walks to her room and sits on the bed and stares at the wall for a very long time. Later at night the little boy hears a loud bang and someone falls on the floor in the garage, and another sound of several banging noises like a baseball bat or a pipe or a golf club. The boy walks over to the little sister's girl's room and says, "Hush! It's a secret." He says slowly, "Someone is in the garage on the floor." The little girl walks the little boy back to the room and says, "Shh, it's a secret and go to bed, I will check it out." The boy goes back in the bed and falls asleep as soon as he hits the pillow. The little girl walks towards the garage and sees the rude man Tom tied up on a chair in the garage. She looks around and sees nobody to the right or left of her. She panics because the rude man Tom is not moving any of his arm, hand or body. The little girl hides behind the washer and dryer and ducks down to hide. All of a sudden the grandmother walks in and places a book on the floor with candles and says to him, "Hush! It's a secret." The grandmother walks over to the toolbox and grabs a hammer and turns around and starts hitting rude Tom in the skull until the grandmother drops the hammer near the dryer. The grandmother walks over to the axe and tries to pick it up until she sees the little girl running and smiles and chases her. She comes closer and closer to the little girl until she stops and says, "Hush! It's a secret." All of a sudden the little girl runs out of the garage and down the street in shock and in fear. The grandmother starts running after her with a hammer and blood all over her hands and clothes and body. The little girl runs into the forest and through the woods and she sees a patrol car with a police officer that was at the park. She runs faster and faster until she reaches the cop car and starts hitting the vehicle with her hands or stick she found in the woods. The police officer comes outside and says what is the matter, but the little girl can't talk because she is in shock and just had surgery on her mouth. The cop says, "Shh, don't talk, I will find out what is happening." The cop turns around and the grandmother hits in the skull with a hammer and the cop collapses to the floor in a pool of blood. The grandmother turns and says to the daughter, "Hush, it's a secret." The grandmother swings the hammer at her but misses dramatically. The little girl falls to the ground and then gets back up and runs back into the wooded forest with the grandmother right behind her screaming, "Hush! It's a secret!" The little girl runs to the end of the trail and stops at the edge of the cliff 1,000 feet high, and she ducks under a branch not to be seen and hides. The grandmother approaches the edge of the cliff and sees the little girl hiding under the branch and sneaks up behind her to hit her in the skull with the hammer. All of a sudden she turns around and sees the little boy standing in front of her and he says, "Hush! It's a secret!" He pushes the grandmother off the cliff and she falls to her death. The little boy helps his little girl sister up and walks down the path with police and cops and SWAT approaching them. One cop tells the other officer that was a serial killer that killed people with a hammer for the past 10 years and they could never find her. The little girl and the little boy walk past the military police, but the police officer grabs them and says, "What happened tonight? Tell me everything." The little girl says to the SWAT police officer, "Hush, it's a secret."